Today's video is going to be regarding why and when to use data structures, arrays, structs, and it's probably going to be very specific to how I make my own games. That's really the only kind of advice I can give is how I do things. I'll try and include things that I've heard as well. I'm trying to be as holistic as possible. But if you have other reasons for using different data structures in different ways, please let us know in the comments below. You won't just be helping me, you will be potentially helping somebody else as well. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank my patrons for continuing to patronize me. Thank you. Okay, so when I am designing a system, whether it's inventory, something to do with stats, anything like that, and I know I'm going to need some kind of data structure, and I mean including arrays and structs within the term data structures as well. So whenever I know I'm going to need something like that, I generally ask myself three questions. The first one is the size of the data structure something I will know in advance, or could it change during gameplay? The second question has kind of two parts to it. The first part being, do I need to save and load this data? And if so, how do I want to be able to save and load it? And the last entry is, what will I be using this data structure for? Okay, so I'm going to do something a little bit different than I had planned. Originally, I was going to expand on the questions first, but I think I will go through the different kinds of data structures, not all of them, just the ones that I tend to use most of all, explain what I think are the pros and cons of it, and why I would or wouldn't use something, and then maybe I will go back to the questions and give you some examples, like some situations of when and why I would use a particular data structure. So first of all, we have arrays. I tend to use arrays if I know how many entries maximum something needs to hold. I tend to use it to store strings, for example, for menu options. Not always, but quite often I do. Anything I know in advance that is defined and I don't need to save between games, I'll make it an array, because I don't tend to use JSON. So and why an array and not a list? Good question. It's not generally something that I worry about, but arrays are a little faster than other data structures from what I've read. One thing to note as well is that they are automatically garbage collected. What that means is you don't have to worry about memory leaks. For example, with a list or a grid, when you store a list or a grid in a variable, you're actually storing a pointer to where that list or grid is stored. And if you lose that pointer, for example, if you overwrite the variable or you get rid of the data structure that held the pointer, then you're not going to be able to get that pointer back, and that's how you get a memory leak. It's also now really easy to add dimensions to an array using the square brackets. I also tend to compare grids to 2D arrays, but that's not entirely accurate because a grid is a rectangular shape, whereas a 2D array can have like a jagged shape. So every row could have a different number of entries. So the first entry could have like 10 entries, the second one could have 5, the third could have 15. You can just add as many or as few as you like. So why you might need that, I don't know, but if you ever did need that, that's a reason to consider using arrays. And you can also save arrays using JSON stringify, which I know a lot of people do like to use JSON to save their data with. So that's another good reason. So with structs, I have to say that I don't use them in GameMaker. I've tried to use them for a couple of different things. I have followed what people use them for in the forums and tried to understand the reasons people are using them. Generally, though, I do not at the moment see the benefit of using structs over other data structures. For example, um, I've mentioned a few times that I like to set all of my stats in a CSV file because I like to have all those stats in columns and rows next to each other. I find that really useful. And then there's a function called load CSV, so I can turn that file into a grid, and then because it's in a grid, I just use grids, to transfer data. I do have to make an enumerator to go along with that CSV file in order to keep readability. One benefit of structs is that you can just name the variables whatever you like, and you access them as though you would access a struct or a variable from an object. And you don't have to create an enum to go along with it, which is good. So there may be something I can do with them, but I just haven't. They're not this amazing game-changing things for GameMaker for me right now. I just haven't found a good reason to use them. Some people call them lightweight objects. I don't know if you've ever done a test where you just keep creating instances in a room and just to watch your FPS fall to see how many you can have in a room at a time. I believe structs would have less of an effect on your FPS than objects do. Don't quote me, but that's what I think people mean when they say it's lightweight. And also, like arrays, you can save structs in JSON easily with JSON stringify. So with the other data structures, things like lists, grids, queues, one reason to use them is they come with a lot of extra functions. I'll come up with some examples after I've gone through this. For now, I just want to give basic pros and cons for these. So with lists, stacks, and queues, they're all great for one-dimensional dynamic data structures. Stacks are last in, first out. So imagine a card game where you always have to take the top card, and you're not going to know how many cards there could be in the pile at any one time. That's when you might want to use a stack because you always have to take the top card first. Queues, I'm not talking about priority queues, just actual DS queues. They are first in, first out. For example, you might add some instances to a queue and you want to access them in the order in which they were added. Priority queue. So you might want to add things to a queue with a priority, and you can get the thing with either the highest or lowest priority first. So imagine you're making a battle system and the actors get to go in the order of their speed stat. All you would do is you add the instance IDs to the queue, with the priority being the actor's speed stat. Grids, like I say, I always think of them as like a rectangular 2D array, but with the bonus of functions we can use on the data that's stored there. For example, in my XCOM tutorial series, I copy regions of the grid from another grid, which is something you can't do as easily with arrays. You have to code it yourself. I mean, basically, the reason to use most of these data structures is to avoid having to code things yourself because of the existing functions. And as I've mentioned, I really like to use DS Grid read and write so I can save and store my information. Lists, I save lists for last to talk about because I use them the most probably. They are dynamic in size, and you can delete entries in the middle and the whole thing will resize itself. And you can also easily add new things to a list. For example, you can add 10 things to a list just using one line. Lists also have DS list write and read, just like DS Grid does, which turns their contents into strings, which you can then save to a file. It's pretty easy to save a lot of data that way. An example to use a list. So imagine you again have a battle system and you want to track what status effects are affecting an actor right now. You're not going to know on a step-by-step basis how many status effects they may have. So a list is going to be better than an array. For most cases, it's a lot harder to do that with an array. So I think now is actually a good time to go into some examples of when I might use a data structure compared to something else. Okay, so for the first example, imagine that we want to make an inventory, and when the player looks at their inventory, we want it to be displayed in rows and columns. And because of that, I would want to use a two-dimensional data structure. You don't have to, but in my mind, it makes it a lot easier, more simple, less complex. And so you can either go for a grid or a 2D array. The reason I would use a grid is because I like to use DS Grid write and read. There's no reason why you can't use the 2D array though, and use JSON to save. In the next example, imagine we have a turn-based battle system and we want our actors to take their turn in order of their speed stats, as I mentioned earlier. So for me, the obvious choice would be a priority queue because we can add the IDs of the actors to the queue and also give them a priority value, which in this case would be their speed stat. And then it's really easy to use DS priority delete min and delete max to either get the guy with the highest or lowest speed. And also, say for example, you have a spell that increases or decreases their speed. You could just simply use this DS priority change priority. In this example, imagine you have a monster who has 4 or 5 different skills and you want him to use a random one. All you have to do is have a list of their skills, use DS list shuffle, and pick the first entry. Following on from the last example, what about if you wanted the monster to cast a heal spell, but only as long as there was an ally who had less than 50% hit points remaining? Well, all you would do is I would already have a list of monsters that were alive, and I would loop through that list. And any of them who had less than 50% HP, I'd add them to another list called injured or something. And then if the size of the injured list was greater than 1, I would have that monster cast the spell.